A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
So let's turn our attention to, for what many is a very contentious issue. It often drives the differences in the political divide between left and right. Well, the focus today is not so much on the culture war, which is mostly about a social agenda, but on the economic ideology around money and resources and what causes nations to thrive. We might be wondering if there is godly wisdom from the Bible explicitly endorsing either of the systems that we know perhaps as socialism or capitalism. And if there are strengths and weaknesses for both sides, is there a Christian-informed view of a functioning economy that ticks all the right boxes, blending personal responsibility with necessary care, with justice and generosity? Well, finance expert Alex Cook is back with us. Alex Cook is a former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner. He's the founder of Wealth with Purpose, and his ministry is to help equip Christian believers, just like you and I, to honour God with our finances by teaching sound financial skills. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Hey, Neil. Happy new financial year to you.
It is a happy new financial year, and this is a really good time to be talking about what we'll talk about today, because we want to get into the issues that drive our motivations. But before we do, I want to get a bit of an economic update from you. Each time we have one of these segments now, I think listeners are finding it so valuable to get an in a nutshell overall view of our Australian economy and what's happening globally that's affecting us as well. And we might even get into some conversation around, the 3 million Australians or so who'll be getting a 3.5% pay increase, or the super contributions going up to 12%.
Yes.
But there's lots of things to talk about, and there might be questions from listeners. But let's get into a bit of an economic update. Where are you seeing things right now?
Yeah, well, look, a lot going on around the world, obviously, but in good old Australia, our economy continues to sort of soften is probably the best word for it. Economics speak to say that it's weakening. Year-on-year growth was pretty low. I mean, it was only 1.3% with the figures that just recently came out. And if you look at it on the most recent quarter, it was only 0.2%. So the economy really is just limping along. It's particularly weak when you consider we do have a population growth. So on a per capita basis, the Australian economy is weak. Now, that does have its advantages, though, depending on who you are. Obviously, if you've got a job, that's a good thing in this environment. But it also means that inflation's coming down, and I know everyone would be happy with that. Inflation's now sitting at a 4-year low of 2.4%. Now, what that means is doesn't mean prices are coming down. It just means they're going up, obviously, at a slower pace, which I think we can all be relieved about. And, of course, we really want the cost of living to go up at a slower pace than our wages, of course, are going up. As you know, rates were cut last month, and I think the general forecast is that we'll still probably see another 1 or 2 rate cuts later in this year. But ultimately what we're looking at is an economy that is softening, and of course we will see ultimately a flow-on effect there. It's very sector specific though. Construction has been very weak, retail has been very weak, and other sectors not so bad. So it obviously all comes down to where you're at. For example, retirees don't necessarily like this environment of falling rates when they're hoping to get more income on their term deposits. But for those of us out there that are paying off mortgages, obviously it's good to see rate relief come through.
How about stock market performance, Alex? So what's happening on our markets?
Yeah, well, look, that's interesting. In one sense, you'd almost say the stock market is a bit divorced from the economic reality. The stock market has pretty much gone back up to record highs. On a year-by-year basis, it's up, I think, about 9% on last year, which is, a pretty tidy return, particularly when, of course, you add on dividends and so forth. So stock market's not doing too badly, all things considered. But as I say, I think the stock market and the economy don't always trade in sync with each other. And the stock market these days seems to a lot more follow world news, such as what's going on in the US with tariffs and the wars and all the sorts of things that are going on around our world at the moment. So,
okay.
But not too bad for investors.
All right. Well, that's actually sounding relatively positive. What about global economic issues and their impacts on our national economy here? How are you seeing things right now?
Yeah, well, look, in one sense, the global economy is fairly similar in that it is also weakening and it's expected to continue to weaken. And, of course, many central banks around the world are also in the same process as the Australian Reserve Bank and are also lowering rates themselves. So, in one sense, it's a similar pattern play in other countries, and many of them, of course, are also had the high inflation over the last few years. Starting to see that come. I think that the bigger issue, though, concerning people on a more global basis, is the two big things. One is the in administration and what it's doing with tariffs and the uncertainty that that's causing everyone. No one really knows. I mean, the problem with economics is people try and tell you what they think will happen, but the truth is no one really knows how these things are going to unfold, with all the tariff arrangements that the US are in the process of still negotiating. But those in and of themselves are, contributing to the uncertainty, and therefore I think that's why you're starting to see an increasingly weaker economy, especially in the US as well as obviously here. But of course, the bigger issue in the last month has been the attack of Israel on Iran, and what are the implications from that? I mean, I know there's a sort of a ceasefire in place at the moment, but that could really change at any minute. And I find it hard to believe that Iran is just going to sit there and not do a lot with all that's going on. And of course, the big fear that everyone has, both with the Ukraine war as well as the Middle Eastern war, is if these go from being relatively isolated between one or two countries to more regional wars or, something worse than that. I think that is the big question, and no one really knows. I tend to think if you look at things cyclically, be it the economy or war, you'd have to say we're not entering into a forward. And as I say, I don't want to be trying to attempt to be prophetic about it, but you would certainly say that we're not heading in the right direction geopolitically at the moment.
Okay.
And the world is changing.
There were some positives about Australia's economy, but there's a lot of things that you would be cautious about, and even negatives in a global sense that are affecting us here in Australia. And with the wars and the unknown unsettledness that brings, along with the ways that things are shifting, so far as you mentioned, tariffs, but also these trade wars, geopolitical rivalries, shifting alliances. How do we see those, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think they're the things that are going to ultimately flow through to us all as individuals. I think obviously the big one is if, particularly with the trade war between China and America, if that continues to escalate, the issue is that's more than likely going to weaken the Chinese economy, which of course will flow directly through to Australia because they're our number one trading partner. So we don't really want to see a weaker China. And of course, when economies weaken, that's when politicians tend to turn outwards. In other words, they want to point to an external enemy, and that's where issues like Taiwan will become, front and centre, or indeed war in general, because politicians will need a distraction from the problems at home. And that's one of the big problems when economies turn down and become weaker. Politicians need to find a scapegoat. But of course, also with these geopolitical threats will come issues around energy, and particularly oil oil price. And what we don't want to see is a massive spike in oil price. If Iran were to close the Strait of Hormuz, for example, where 20% of the world's oil goes through, that would, of course, feed through into the petrol bowser ultimately for all of us and weaken the economy. Because at the end of the day, I know people are obsessed with fossil fuels these days, but the reality is the world still runs on them, and the cost of getting your food and everything transported around the world is very dependent on oil prices. So these uncertainties do not help at all. And as I say, it's nice to see the ceasefire. Let's pray it continues, but I think it's hard to believe it's finished at this point, in my view.
There's so much we could explore by way of an economic update on, in a nutshell, what things look like. But that's great, and there might be listeners who have some other questions, and they're welcome to join in, and you can send us a text on 0447 488 316 on those economic issues. But there's some things we want to move into today around the motivations of governments and of individuals, and we might call that an economic ideology, the way we look at the economics of a nation, maybe what we look as we see the economics around the world. I wonder whether you've got any thoughts here as we get into this part of our conversation, Alex, around the different economic ideologies and why it even matters, because a lot of people think that personalities are what it's all about, but economic ideologies are driving political and economic strategies, aren't they?
Enormously. And look, I think to start with why it matters, I think as Christians, one of our concerns need to be what policies within a particular economy and promoted by a particular government, what policies promote human flourishing? What enables man and women to live at their best and to flourish in society. And economics can have a huge impact on our ability to flourish. And that's why these ideologies in a nutshell matter. And of course, there are three prevailing ones, the three isms, socialism, capitalism, and communism. But I think the preoccupation, particularly in the Western world, is socialism versus capitalism. And what I'm starting to see, and part of the reason why I think this matters for Australians, and indeed you see it the same thing in America, is different groups in of people in our society are starting to fracture. If I was to take young Australians, for example, I think there's a sense that the future won't be as good as what my parents had. I won't be able to own my own home. And things that maybe other generations have taken for granted seem to be out of reach. And that is not what you want for young people, because that they'll turn to something that will give them a solution. And that solution might not be good. Likewise, when I look at hardworking families and small business owners in particular, I mean, you've got to remember that small business makes up for 70% of the economy in terms of employment. Many people that I talk to are increasingly frustrated by not only the cost of everything, energy prices going up, but also the regulation of everything. I see it obviously in the finance industry that I operate in, but you see it across many industries, just enormous regulations and rising taxes. And of course, we're seeing the push for this particular unrealised capital gains tax in superannuation. So all of these are sort of pointing to a nation of Australia that was, I think, once free market capitalist. I would say we're not that anymore, and I don't think we've been that for a long time. But we're more and more becoming socialist. And I think the media tends to feed this narrative that the reason for our problems in Australia today and lack of equality, and it's, inequality is growing, is because of capitalism. That's I think their argument that's often spouted. But in fact, I think it's the opposite that is true, is that we've got this socialist system that involves taxing the productive element of society and redistributing it, which kills off incentive, and it forces people to to take action that will not work in the country's long-term interest. And so, once again, these ideologies matter. And look, we can unpack them a bit if you like, Neil, but, what each of them are and what they look like in more detail, because I think my concern amongst Christians as well is that many look at socialism as a compassionate response to the problems that are going on. I would argue that it's the opposite of that will come as a result of it. As Christians, we do have to be compassionate for those that are in need and those who are doing it tough, but the solution is not government interventions. It's Christians rising to the challenge and meeting these needs, as opposed to the government getting heavily involved in the process. And so that's why, once again, I say these things matter, because Christians, I think, are easily influenced by these ideologies too.
Helping you make sense of life, culture, and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
I reckon it'd be a good opportunity here for us, Alex, if you've got your own definitions of how we might see socialism in a nutshell, capitalism in a nutshell, and then we'll try and unpack this and bring that Christian view.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, socialism we'll start with socialism, because I think that's, the one that's getting a lot of airtime these days. And socialism is the idea that really the state or the government, if you like, has significant influence over all of our key industries, whether it's healthcare, whether it's utilities, and over the economy in general, and in particular creating lots of social programs in order to redistribute wealth from one group to another. And it's often built on the logic that there is a economic pie, and that the pie is not fairly divided up, and therefore we need to change that through government intervention so that we all get a bit more of a share of the pie. It sounds good in theory, and it sounds good in the sense I think many Christians would say, well, look, we are of all equal value. God loves us all, and therefore shouldn't we want that sort of equality? But sort of having a society that is where we're all equal is very dangerous, in the sense that it will remove all incentive for success. And probably the simplest example I can give is small business. If you're a small business owner, you're generally taking more risk than your employees. Your employees come to work each day and you give them a paycheck in return. But the employer is responsible for the paying of all the bills, all the stuff, abiding by all the regulations, and they run the risk. And often they've got lots of debt associated with their business. They run the risk of going broke and, having all sorts of challenges in their business in keeping it going. So if you remove the incentive for them to do well and to strive and succeed and to innovate, which is what socialism does, and socialism has always been a failure everywhere it's been tried. It's been tried for a couple of 100 years, and we keep going back to it, and it keeps failing. But this sort of excessive government control and influence will lead to a massive decline in prosperity in the nation. Now, I'll give you an example in the financial planning industry. 5 years ago, there were 30,000 advisors. Today, there are 15,000 advisors because of government regulation. So what is the inevitable outcome of that? Well, the inevitable outcome of that is prices go up for all of Australians because the regulations have gone up, the supply of advisors has gone down, and all you've got is less and less people being able to get advice. So that's just one simple example, and I've just used my own industry to describe that. But you could apply that across many, many sectors of the economy. But as I say, it sounds compassionate because we're talking about taking from someone who may have a lot and giving it to someone who may have a little. But it is very dangerous if it's done in to any form of excess. Capitalism, of course, on the other hand, is a system whereby two groups of people can come together and, agree on doing business together with minimal government intervention. You need the government for some things like applying the rule of law. And, so for example, if two businesses come into conflict, you need someone to uphold the contracts, etc. So you need rule of law to still exist. But ultimately, a capitalist society encourages competition, which lowers prices. I mean, if you look at the Australian supermarket, you've got almost no competition in Australia. You've got a couple of major retailers and very little competition. And so this is one of the problems that's driven by socialism, not by capitalism. We want a highly competitive society which will lead to more and more innovation and more prosperity. And where people feel that they can acquire assets and be rewarded with private property for their hard work and efforts. That is how you grow a society, with people taking risks and moving forward.
There's going to be listener input, and you might have your own critique around these things we're talking about today. You might even have a biblical, godly perspective to be able to offer, and to say that that might have real value for where we go. And does that work individually, or does it work corporately across a whole nation? Let's take a call. Richard is in Alstonville in New South Wales. Hey, Richard, what are your thoughts?
Hey, guys. I had two questions for you. First one being like difference between socialism and capitalism. My understanding of socialism is both, like, it started around World War One in Germany with the German Socialist Party, and both Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, all of them prescribed to socialism at one stage or another, and goes forward to now, or to say 30 years ago. China, like, I've heard a lot of people say that they believe China started the free market capitalist system in what they do, but they profess to be a socialist communist society. What do you make of the other day? Because they've just said to the Prime Minister that we shouldn't spend money on defence, we should be spending money on socialism. Do you think that they're trying to push a control-based, system as opposed to America?
Good thoughts in here, Richard, and pointing out some things that may for some seem obvious. I think that socialism goes back to, you would say, Karl Marx, who'd be mid-19th century, so we're not talking around world wars here. But, thoughts from you, Alex Cook, for Richard and his thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think he's raised some really interesting points. I think ultimately where this debate ends up is, what role do we see that government should have in our lives, and to what extent is that? How far should that go? Because Richard raised a really good point on defence. Now, to me, one of the key fundamental roles of society, of government, is to provide a defence force, a police force, to provide rule of law, and to provide those foundational elements. And that should exist even in a capitalist society. So I think those things are good things. Where I think it becomes more complicated is when you start interfering in business transactions and the way people do business with each other, when you get excessive regulations across all industries. And we're now in a society where when a problem occurs, everyone cries out loud, "Hey, government, come and fix it." And of course, the government jumps to attention and does exactly that. It comes in and provides solutions. Those solutions, though, rarely work and often can compound the problem. And so I think, Richard's concern is the correct one, is that we are moving to more and more control over everything. We see that with climate policies. We see that with regulation of various industries, as I've already given a description on the finance industry, but it really applies across the board. And it stifles innovation. It costs a lot of money. In fact, there was an interesting survey about 5 years ago from the Institute of Public Affairs where they said, I think the average compliance cost per person in Australia, I think it was something like $19,000 per person. It was a staggering figure spent on compliance. We are one of the most regulated countries on the planet. I think we are at the point where our prosperity, and we are historically a very prosperous nation, that is increasingly starting to wane. And with socialism, you get the haves and the have-nots. And that's what is growing in Australia, and more people are going to get, it's going to be more and more angst as this continues to unfold.
Richard, in Alstonville, thank you so much for a good contribution to our conversation today. I was asking you, what should a Christian economy look like? How do we get some wisdom around understanding a Christian economy?
Well, look, I'll lay out some of the principles. I think that's the key thing. Before we cut off, I don't know if people heard, but I said as Christians, I don't think we should buy into any of the isms, whether it's socialism, capitalism or communism. They've all got, strengths and weaknesses. And with communism, it's particularly got a lot of weaknesses. But nonetheless, the issue is, what are the principles that would drive a Christian economy? So I think one of them is the understanding that the resources that we have available to us are from God, and they actually belong to God. Now, I appreciate that our society is so secular these days that wouldn't resonate with a lot of people in general, but it's an important starting point philosophically. And that human beings have a responsibility to manage those resources for the common good and to enable human flourishing. So I think it's very important that it starts with that principle. The other thing is, you need a just society where everyone is treated equally under the law. And what we're starting to see, I think, particularly in the Western world, and, America's probably more extreme, is where people are treated differently according to who they are in society. And I think that is very, very problematic, and we should all be equal before the law. And I think, Christianity would support that. But also from the point of view of in society, you're always going to have people for need. And the Bible makes a very strong emphasis on the need to care for the poor, for the widows and the orphans, etc. And the biblical model for that though is voluntary. In other words, that the people of society, and I think back to when I was younger, you walk around and collect money for the Salvation Army. It cost me my time to go and do that. We need people to have that kind of mindset where I'm willing to give up something for others, for the common good and for helping those in need. And so there's a voluntary nature to our society where it says, I want to help others that are less fortunate than myself. And of course, as we drift away from our Christian foundations, of course, we're seeing, volunteer rates, et cetera, and all those sort of things plummet. Then, of course, there's the dignity of work. Work is extremely important. When you look at the 7-day creation, God created the world and worked, and on the seventh day he rested. We as people are designed to work, and we want to help people to find value in their God-given calling. Everyone's got different skills and gifts and talents. We want people to be able to exercise their gifts. So you want to live in a society that enables their God-given calling. So we want policies that support that. And of course, where people are paid fairly for the work that they're doing. And also, I think in a society like that where business particularly is enabled, so it's allowed to flourish and do well, but where those in charge are not greedy. And I think one of the things that we've seen, particularly over the last 30 years in the Western world, is extreme corporate greed. So business has the power to create wealth and do enormous good. I'm very pro-business. But the problem is if it's run by people with the wrong heart, and that's why, unfortunately, economics and money issues are ultimately very, you can legislate all you want, but at the end of the day, there is a heart issue to all of this. And that is that those in charge have the right heart and operate under the right principles.
Alex,
because I'll never.
Is it possible is it possible that that capitalism actually sometimes becomes its own worst enemy, because the exploitation and the corporate greed that comes from certain areas of leaders in business and industry, that actually it works against the capital idea because this human nature gets in the way.
Absolutely. And I think what we're starting to see in the West is it's not capitalism, it's cronyism, where those at the top are trading in favours between government and business. I think we've seen a lot of that in recent years. But also, as I say, just the corporate excesses. I mean, one example I'll never forget as long as I live was a guy who got terminated from running, I think it was Home Depot, a huge, American business, and he got paid $120 million on termination. I mean, how does this sort of madness even get to occur? But that's the sort of thing when I think cronyism becomes in, and those at the top are all, rubbing each other's backs. That's not a true capitalist society at all. It's cronyism. So, as I say, and I think you rightly point out, Neil, none of them none of them are perfect, and that's why each of these issues need to be driven by the biblical principles, the biblical heart that sits behind it. And that heart says, I want human beings to flourish and do well in their God-given calling.
And we'll talk some more about that. Hey, we are taking calls on 1800 316 316. You can send us a text on 0447 488 316. Let's take another call. Graham is in Tasmania. Graham, thanks for waiting so patiently. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts, what's happening in the world today as far as trade. The European Union wants to trade powerfully, and America is a reflection of the trade to come, where force and people will trade because you're going to be pushed into trading in the later days. We have Israel now has been pushing very hard against the Muslims, which will bring about a peace for 7 years. Daniel 9:27. We're in a situation, we're seeing reflections through Mr. Trump. It's not Mr. Trump's the beast, but a reflection of the future where I believe that a great nation will flex its muscles for trade. And everybody now wants to trade. And we're heading to a situation where there's wars, lots of wars and lots of trouble. And Israel wants to sacrifice on the Temple Mount. And all this pressure is going to, I believe, not that far away will happen. And it will bring peace. And it will be great.
Graham, there's an eschatological perspective you're bringing here, and I don't know whether Alex is an expert around eschatology, but a lot of people are looking at these sorts of things and saying, what is it in the circumstances that builds a environment towards some of those things that look very much like a biblical end times scenario. So have you got a general perspective on that?
Neil, you're asking my question about
throwing you in the deep end.
Yeah, look. Yeah, sure. Look, I wouldn't have a particular eschatological view towards these things. I think that's more, beyond my pay grade. It's more, something I would expect a pastor to be able to comment more on in terms of the end times and so forth. That seems sign where, we are starting to see biblical prophecy fulfilled. But on Graham's topic of trade, he's talking about all the trade between nations, which is changing rapidly. But also, I think the really interesting one is as we get towards the end, when you end up with a one world government where you won't be able to trade unless you're part of the beast system. And, and there'll be the mark of the beast. And, people have been speculating about that one for years as well.
It's interesting that when we think of trade issues and biblical scenarios for end times, there is a risk, isn't there, that you can say, hands off. It's all inevitable. I have no responsibility now to be able to talk about how the trade, how the economy, how the ideological perspectives that might bring about the thriving nation. We could actually say, we'll throw our hands up in the air and say it's all too hard, but that's actually not the Christian view either. The Christian view correct. Is to occupy until he comes, and that means actually rolling up your sleeves and being involved in the situation to bring about positive change because you are concerned about the poor and the needy and the vulnerable.
100%.
Because if you throw your hands up in the air and say it's all inevitable, not up to me, you've given up, haven't you?
100%. And I'm of like your view, and you meet people all the time that talk about the end times, and I think there's nothing wrong with talking about it at all. And I think we should be very awake and aware of what's going on around us. But at the end of the day, I always come back to the very simple fact that each of us has a responsibility under God to fulfill what he is calling us to do. And, at the bigger picture, that's the Great Commission that we're all called to be part of. But each of us, obviously, of course, has been given different talents and different skills that we are to use for the kingdom until until Jesus returns. That to me is the critical thing, and that we don't get distracted by a lot of the things that are going on around the world, because it can be, disheartening, some of it. And I think the reality is we should be excited about the future and thinking, how as a Christian can I be part of what God is doing around the world, reaching the lost and helping those and bringing God's kingdom to the earth. That's what we need to be focused on doing.
Okay, I want to thank Graham from Tasmania for his input today, and our talkback line's still open on 1800 316 316. You can send us a text 0447 488 316, as Wendy has done, in saying, my older brother says if you're not a socialist when you're young, you've got no heart, but if you're still a socialist when you're older, you've got no brain. A good discussion point, says Wendy, and I've heard that. It's actually quite a well-known saying. It's a well-known saying. And but it's interesting, isn't it? Because while there are strengths and weaknesses to both sides, you can be flippant about these things, but you do want the care for the vulnerable and the poor. Which you've got to then argue, if you are going to be a capitalist, as to how that care for the poor and the vulnerable actually works under your capitalist system. So that's a significant thing. Hey, we haven't got a lot of time for the conversation. I do want to get into where we go with this as individuals. If we're talking about, as you've delivered some outstanding wisdom these past few minutes, Alex Cook, on what a Christian economy might look like, and how we actually apply that to ourselves, and then it can permeate through our community and then into our nation. What sort of activity ought the Christian believer be doing to actually see these things come to pass?
Look, I think there's a few critical things that we can do. I mean, I think the first thing is we need to be informed about these different ideological positions as they apply in our society today. We need to understand what they really mean. But more importantly, we need to really understand where they'll take us. Because, as I say, many Christians I'm finding are starting to really buy into socialism on the idea that it's compassionate. But it's not compassionate if the outcomes are poor. So it may sound good, but if the outcomes are poor and don't enable human flourishing, then it's a failure. And so my challenge to Christians is not to just buy into the sound bites that politicians are parading around, but rather more to have that biblical mindset about what our responsibilities are as believers, and to inject that into the debate and into our society. We need to be more actively involved in our society, whether it's in political or all the way through down to the local level, where we are, providing an alternative view to the way things should be done. Because as at the moment, my concern is the West is on this path of saying the government has to do everything. And really, it's the church's responsibility, I think, to step up and do a lot of these things. And so once again, I would encourage Christians to pray for the nation, pray that we'll have godly leaders that will promote policies that will enable people to flourish in their God-given calling, and that will follow economic ideologies that are based on biblical principles, as opposed to buying into any of the isms and the flaws of those.
Come to perhaps a straight shooter, don't hold back no punches, where you think Australia is at the present time, on our current trajectory, what we might be headed for, on the possibilities that there might be some of these, as we talk about God's wisdom, biblical understanding, Christians taking control of certain things and not being entirely socialist, not be perhaps entirely capitalist, but having a Christian view about where things might go. What's your pull no punches perspective on where we are right now, Alex Cook?
Look, my blunt assessment is that Australia's prosperity is absolutely guaranteed to decline in the future unless we reverse course. We're going down this path of government intervention across all industries, across all aspects of our life. The government seems to, and if you look at the current government with all their taxation policies and what they keep dreaming up, it's all about redistribution and taking from one group to another. I think that's going to lead to a more corrupt society. Because that's what, if you look at South America as a perfect example of flawed socialism, those societies are full of haves and have-nots and are very, very corrupt. And that's where we will end up if we keep going down this trajectory. Is there hope? Absolutely. The hope is that Christians intervene in multiple ways. One, obviously, is the starting point of prayer. We need to be praying for our nation. But more importantly, we need to become actively involved in the debate on the very issues that we're talking about, whether it's caring for the poor, whether it's taxation, any of these sort of issues, we need to be actively involved in these debates and not just say these are secular issues. Actually, they're not. They're human issues, and we have the answers in the Scripture to guide us, and they will work. And, if you look at America and Australia, where they were largely, not absolutely, but largely founded on Christian principles, they were nations that flourished. And that prosperity is declining in both of them because we're abandoning the principles that made us great. And so, we need to change course very, very quickly, or it will get tougher.
And sometimes, as Christian believers, we're looking for the biblical proof text to base what we think about in these things. But I guess you've got to be able to explore and understand more deeply, perhaps a theological, reflective way of thinking about how those principles actually come about. And, so many listeners are so familiar with you, Alex Cook, and talk about our necessary stewardship about justice and equality, and about the fact that we're needing to be generous and having work and dignity and humility over greed. Those sorts of things you can do a study on, and you can discover those, and there are some texts that you base those things on, but you've got to be able to let those things take root and grow in you.
Absolutely.
So that's what actually affects you and your family and your broader community, and then ultimately the nation. Wonderful insights as always, Alex Cook. And I know that there'll be some listeners who might want to connect with you in some way to be able to maybe even ask a personal question. I know you have a email that's simply askalex@wealthwithpurpose.com for people to be able to ask a question. But wealthwithpurpose.com is Alex's website. There's lots of free resources available there. You can follow Alex on Facebook or on X, Twitter, and you can keep a track of what he's doing. He's doing all sorts of programs, developing all sorts frequently with individuals. And as someone who has a ministry to help equip Christians to honour God with their finances by teaching sound financial skills, I must say I always appreciate having these conversations with you, Alex Cooks, and for listeners to connect with you, my pleasure to be able to recommend they do that. Hey, thanks so much for taking some time to share your heart with listeners once again today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. My pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.